understanding populations and samples, and using samples to make population predictions. Standard 7 SP.2 and SP.3. This is what we have covered over the past week, and we're going to combine it all into one video to help you prepare for your upcoming quiz. So we've been talking about what a population is and what a sample is. So let's look at an example to make sure we understand what's going on. 560 students are surveyed. All surveys were placed in a box, and 70 surveys were selected at random. So let's take a look there. So we know that the 500 is important and the 70 is important. Remember, the population is the whole, the sample is a part of the whole. So the population is going to be the bigger number. So the population is going to be the 560 students surveyed. And then my sample is going to be the 70 surveys selected at random. Now, if you've been paying attention in class, you know that there's always one more question that is usually added to that, and that is if the sample is biased or unbiased. So let's go ahead and answer that question. So we know 560 students are going to be surveyed. That's our population. That has nothing to do with being biased or unbiased. We want a fair mix of every student that has been surveyed to make sure that we can make a good prediction. So if the 70 surveys were selected at random, that means that all of the students had a choice at being selected and only 70 of them were selected. So this is going to be an unbiased sample. Oops. Let's take a look at one more example to make sure we understand what's going on. So now, let's get rid of the box. So here we go. So this one says 300 middle school students were surveyed. Only the girls' surveys were looked at to make the decision. So I'm going to circle my number. So I only have one number, so I know my population is going to be the 300 middle school students. It's always important to keep the units with your numbers, because otherwise you could be talking about 300 elephants, 300 ducks. You want to make sure that it's conveying the right message. So now the difficult question comes into looking at my sample. I have no other numbers, so that means I'm going to need to read and do some investigation. So it says only the girls' surveys were looked at. So in talking about being fair, is it only fair if the girls' surveys are being looked at? Nope. We know that that's our sample, so I'm going to write only girls' surveys. So since it's not fair that the boys' surveys aren't even having a chance to get looked at, this is a biased sample to look at because it is not fair. Now, if you're a girl and watching this, it might seem fair because you think that your opinion matters and yours would be looked at. However, if you're a boy and watching this, it's not going to be fair because you basically took the survey for no reason. Now let's look at what we started yesterday. This is where we use a sample to make a prediction about what is actually going on. So let's take a look at our first and only example on this because it's pretty straightforward. While I'm reading, I'm going to be underlining and circling any important things that I need to know. 800 middle school students were surveyed about their favorite basketball team. Of those surveyed, 100 surveys were randomly selected, and 80 of those surveys stated they were a U of L fan. Based on the sample, make a prediction for the population. All right, so I've got all my important stuff there that I need to know. I know that it's random, so it's fair, so I know that I can go ahead and work on this. So the first thing I'd like to do is figure out what the population is. So I'm just going to use P for population and S for sample. So the population is the whole. I know that's my 800 students, so I'm going to write 800. I know that's my population. And my sample. So now I've got these two other numbers that I can look at. Does it make sense if you only have a sample of 80 that 100 people could say something? Nope. So you know out of your two numbers that are left, whichever one is the bigger of the smaller numbers, that's what your sample is. So my sample is going to be 100. Now we're going to do what I love to use, which are proportions. So I'm going to draw my one little proportion line and my other proportion line. So I'm going to do all of my samples on one side, so I know that my sample is out of 100. So I'll just make a note that this is my sample side. And then I've also got my population. I'll write that in another color. So my population is out of 800, and I'll note that for you. So my population is 800. So we need to know, based off of our sample, how many the population is going to be. Well, I know 80 people out of the sample that I took of 100 voted for U of L. Go Cards. In my population, I don't know how many. That's where I'm using my sample to make my prediction. So now that I've got my proportion set up, I can cross multiply. So I'm going to do 100 times x, which gives me 100x, which is equal to, and we'll do another color, 80 times 800, which is going to give me 64,000. Now I need to get my x by itself, so I'm going to divide each side by what's with the variable or the x, which is 100. When I do that, these cancel out, and I am left with x equaling 640 people would be U of L fans. So what does that number mean? Well, let's go back and look. So out of our sample, we know that 80 of the 100 people would vote for U of L. So if we were looking at the whole population and didn't take a sample, we would make a good estimate to say that 640 of those people would be U of L fans. And that's all it is to it. So as long as you know how to set up a proportion and read, you should be good.